Did you know that an electric car created almost a century ago could already travel more than 300 kilometers on a single charge? It seems like a lie, but it's true. An impressive feat for any era. Even more so if we consider that, in that decade, most roads were dirt, combustion engines were barely in their efficiency, and charging an electric vehicle seemed like something worthy of science fiction. Still, this car existed. It was tested, approved, praised by engineers of the time, and then, mysteriously, it disappeared. It was never mass-produced. It was never reported in the newspapers with the enthusiasm it deserved. It never reached the general public. It's as if someone had pulled the wires and cut off the energy of this dream. The story, you will now learn, is much more than a simple case of forgotten technology. It's a chapter deleted on purpose, and the reasons behind this say a lot about the world we live in, yesterday and today. For decades, we have been led to believe that electric cars are a 21st century novelty, something modern, futuristic, exclusive to companies like Tesla or Silicon Valley startups. But what if I told you that this narrative is false? That electric cars were already considered superior in several aspects at the beginning of the last century? That they were quiet, clean, and, in some cases, more efficient than their gasoline rivals? The problem wasn't the technology. The problem was the system. This car that we are going to reveal in this video could have changed everything. It emerged at a delicate moment in history. The world was beginning to rebuild after a great war. Cities were growing, industry was gaining strength, and fossil fuels were becoming the engine of progress. But there was hidden in a little-known workshop, a project that challenged all of that. An electric car with real performance, with autonomy that would put even many current models to shame, and with the potential to become the standard for urban mobility. But that's not what happened. Why would it be? It's hard to believe that such a promising vehicle was abandoned by chance, or due to simple technical difficulties. Even more so when documents from the time show that it passed all initial tests, that it caught the attention of investors, and that it was even presented at engineering events at the time. So what happened? Who was behind the silence that fell on this project? We are not talking about fiction. We are talking about a true story of something that was ignored, silenced, and swept under the industry rug. And that's precisely why you need to watch this video until the end. Because maybe, by understanding what they did with this car in the past, we can understand what is still happening behind the scenes today. Yes, because many of the problems that this vehicle faced back then are still faced by today's electric cars. The difference is that today we have the internet. We have access to information. We have the ability to question. But at that time, whoever had control of information also controlled what would be remembered and what would be erased from history. This car did not fail. He was sabotaged, and the truth is about to be revealed. You will understand in the next few minutes how a simple innovation could have completely changed the history of mobility. You will find out who had a direct interest in burying this project and why it was treated as a threat and not as a solution. What happened to this car was not a mistake, nor a lack of technology. It was a decision, a choice made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And when you discover the names and documents involved, you may start to question the entire narrative you've been told about electric cars to date. Stay until the end, because I'm going to show you little-known details, forgotten historical records, and a revelation that connects this car, which was silenced in the past, with the challenges we face today in the present. The story you will hear could completely change the way you see the automotive industry and who really runs it. To understand why this electric car was erased from history, we need to go back in time a few decades, more precisely to the 1940s, a period marked by war, reconstruction, and explosive technological advancement. The world was changing, and fast. Cities grew, automobiles took to the streets, and oil became increasingly valuable. But, amidst all this, a bold, idea began to take shape in a place few people know about, a modest workshop led by an engineer who refused to follow the conventional path. His name was almost unknown outside of technical circles. He wasn't a celebrity, he didn't appear in the newspapers. But for those who understood engineering, that man was a visionary. While everyone was betting on noisy, polluting, combustion-powered engines, he dreamed of something different: silence, efficiency, sustainability, even though at that time, this word was not yet in vogue. He began to work in secret. It used repurposed parts from decommissioned planes, submarine batteries, and electrical components developed during the war. The objective was simple and bold: to create a vehicle that did not depend on fossil fuels, that had great autonomy, and that anyone could use, even without understanding anything about mechanics. The prototype was ready in mid-1947. It was strange, almost futuristic by the standards of the time. Smooth lines, no exhaust, without the noise characteristic of traditional cars. The engine was clean, compact, but what caught the most attention was the range: more than 300 kilometers on a single charge. In internal tests, it easily surpassed gasoline models in terms of efficiency and cost per kilometer driven. But there was a problem that went far beyond engineering. News of the car spread quickly within certain circles. Business people, investors, and representatives of major automakers were invited to see the demonstration. Some were fascinated, others are worried. A car with this range, that didn't need gasoline, that was cheap to maintain, and that didn't emit smoke, could represent a revolution. But revolutions don't please everyone. It wasn't long before the engineer began to feel a strange pressure. Proposals to buy the project began to emerge, with very high prices but always with the same condition: he would have to abandon development and give up all rights. When he refused, the threats began. First, veiled, then straightforward. He started to be treated as an obstacle. His patents were questioned. His name was removed from conferences. Some magazines that had published glowing articles about the project suddenly began to remove the articles from the air. There were no explanations, just silence. A cold, calculated silence. And then came the final blow. A few months after the official demonstration, the engineer's workshop suffered a fire. Officially, it was classified as an electrical accident, but nothing was saved. All the prototypes, the documents, the notes, the plans, everything turned to ashes. He tried to rebuild the project from what he remembered, but without support, without funding, and now without credibility, it was impossible to continue. And so, a revolutionary car, with the potential to change history, disappeared. Disappeared without leaving a trace, without becoming a newspaper article, without turning into a history book, as if it had never existed. But those close to him, friends, professional colleagues, former students, never forgot. Some reported years later that he was suspicious, almost paranoid, that he feared he was being followed, who said he was being watched by people in suits who asked too many questions and listened too much. Others claimed he was forced to sign confidentiality agreements, that his family was threatened, that he gave up out of fear, not of competition, but of something much bigger, and the most intriguing thing. They say that a large automaker at the time, whose name was never officially linked to the case, began to internally develop an electric car project with specifications almost identical to the engineer's. But the project was shelved due to lack of market interest. It never saw the light of day. Have you heard this story before? Probably not. And it's not by chance. The dominant narrative about electric cars is that they only began to truly evolve in the 2000s. Before that, they were rudimentary experiments with little range, little efficiency, and no commercial appeal. But this story, carefully put together, ignores dozens of serious, competent, and visionary attempts, many of which were silenced. This is just one of the cases. But it symbolizes something bigger: the struggle of ideas against established power, a clash between innovation and economic interest. between progress and immediate profit. And unfortunately, innovation is almost always the loser. When you understand the context of this car, you begin to realize that the history of electric mobility is not just made up of advances. It is made of battles, of sabotage, of decisions that shaped the present invisibly. And the scariest thing? It's just that much of what happened with that project still happens today, with small startups trying to compete against giants, with promising technologies mysteriously disappearing, and with questions that remain unanswered. The past was not just forgotten, it was hidden, and now, little by little, it is coming back to the surface. They didn't want this car to exist, not because it didn't work, not because it was weak or unfeasible. On the contrary, he was too good. And that was exactly the problem. It was too efficient, too quiet, too cheap. It was a risk for a billion-dollar industry that was growing quickly and didn't want competition. The name of the responsible engineer has almost disappeared from the records. The technical documents are gone. The prototypes were lost in a strange fire shortly after a visit from external consultants who, curiously, left no record. Coincidence? At that time, the world was governed by economic blocks that were shaping the future based on a single promise: fossil fuel. Oil was power. Oil was the domain. Entire countries were being reorganized to ensure access, control, and distribution of black gold. And anything that threatened that logic needed to be controlled, neutralized, or, in the case of this car, turned off. Imagine the impact. A car that doesn't need gasoline, that can be recharged with basic electricity, that doesn't require constant engine maintenance, oil changes, filters, exhaust, belts. Now imagine how many entire sectors would be affected by the mass adoption of such a vehicle. Gas stations, mechanical workshops, petrochemical industries, transporters, mining companies, governments. It was a systemic threat, a real danger to the economic order that was emerging. And the solution was simple: eliminate the threat while it was still small. Sources from the time, few but valuable, mention that the project even attracted the attention of a European consortium interested in producing it on a large scale. But as soon as the news began to circulate, this same group gave up overnight, citing market changes. Detail: a week later, one of the main financiers received $1 million injection of capital from a giant in the fuel industry. Another clue: the engineer responsible tried to re-register the patent for the regenerative battery system he had developed. It was denied. They claimed that something similar had already been registered years before, a record that, curiously, was never found in official databases. It disappeared, just like the inventor himself, who, years later, died in silence without ever speaking publicly about his project again. But that wasn't the only victim. Throughout the 20th century, several similar initiatives emerged. Lighter electric prototypes with compact engines, some even with rudimentary solar panels. They all faced the same fate: mysterious disinterest, funding cuts, or some kind of sabotage disguised as bureaucracy. It's as if there were an unwritten rule: the electric car can only exist if it does not threaten the status quo. And for a long time, that's exactly what happened. In the 1990s, General Motors launched the EV1, an electric car that impressed in range, comfort, and design. But a few years later, all the models were recalled and destroyed. The project was closed, citing lack of public interest. But documents revealed later show another reality. The pressure came from automotive parts suppliers and oil companies, who would lose billions with the popularization of cars that required almost no maintenance and used no fuel. The case of this 1940s car was just the first of many. A clear warning: the automotive industry, united with the fuel industry, has always acted to ensure that the future only arrives when it is convenient for them. And this raises an uncomfortable question: what if electric cars had already won decades ago? What would the world be like today if this technology had been adopted on a large scale in the 50s or 60s? Would we have less pollution in cities? Less dependence on oil? Would we have avoided fuel wars? Could millions of lives have been saved? Billions of dollars saved? These are questions that hurt because they reveal the truth. Progress is not always impeded by technical limitations. Sometimes it is suffocated by economic interests, for profit, for power, and the public. He was deceived. They sold the idea that trams were slow, weak, and too expensive. That needed decades to become viable. But this was all part of a constructed narrative, a lie repeated until it becomes true. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, patents were being purchased, filed, and shelved. Inventors disappeared. Projects disappeared. The press was silenced with publicity. Universities left promising research aside due to lack of funding, and the cycle continued. Today, when we see electric cars finally gaining ground, it's easy to forget how many came before, how many were silenced, how many could have revolutionized the world but were crushed by a system that profits more from delay than from progress. This car, the one in our history, was a symbol of resistance, boldly, but also how innovation is treated when it does not align with the interests of those at the top of the pyramid. And perhaps the most important question is not why this car disappeared, but yes, how many others are disappearing right now before our eyes? Because the game continues. The difference is that today it is more sophisticated, more disguised, but the goal is the same: maintain control. The history of this vehicle is an open wound, and understanding what happened to him is the first step to not letting it happen again. Or worse, to realize that this is still happening. For decades, what was said about this electric car was always shrouded in doubt, misinformation, and silence. To those listening to the story from afar, it seemed more like an urban legend than a real innovation. After all, how can you believe that an electric vehicle from the 1940s had more autonomy than many of the modern models launched on the market almost 80 years later? But the turnaround begins when you discover what almost no one knows. This car has actually been documented. It didn't just exist. It was tested, measured, evaluated. And these data, however hidden they still survive in forgotten reports, archived in technical libraries, spread across universities that discreetly participated in the tests. The name of the vehicle was obfuscated, but the project was known internally as Project 5112E. According to technical records found years later by an independent researcher in Germany, the car used a nickel-iron battery. Yes, a technology that was already out of use even at that time, but which offered absurd durability. More than 1,000 complete charge cycles without significant loss of performance. This detail alone is enough to question much of what was said in subsequent years about the weakness of electric cars. But there's more. The vehicle, which weighed approximately 900 kilograms, had a highly efficient direct current motor coupled with an energy recovery system during braking, what we now know as regenerative braking. An innovation that was only applied on a large scale again in the late 2000s. Yes, that car already did that in 1947, and it was not a theoretical resource as many might imagine. The report found describes that in tests carried out on a closed circuit, the vehicle was able to maintain constant speeds of 60 km/h for up to 6 consecutive hours. This with an energy efficiency level of 92%, a number that, surprisingly, is still difficult to achieve with cheaper modern electric cars. But the real shock is not just technology. It's in what was done to her afterwards. One of the technical reports was stamped, "Classified, restricted access, board only," and the signature in the footer, it belonged to one of the directors of one of the largest oil suppliers at the time. What was an oil company doing with electric car project documents? This is the piece that changes everything. Apparently, this project was discreetly acquired, or rather absorbed, by a financial holding company linked to major interests in the automotive and energy industries. And after that, as we already know, the workshop was destroyed by fire, the files disappeared, and the name of the inventor was slowly erased. But one detail got out of hand. Between the 70s and 80s, a series of patents were registered by a subsidiary of this same holding company. The patents dealt with charging systems, direct current motors optimized for energy efficiency, and nickel-iron cells adapted for light vehicles. These patents were never enforced. No products were launched, no production lines were created. They were simply recorded and archived. Do you know why? Because once registered, no one else could use them. This is the point that many people miss. The blockage to innovation does not only occur in destruction, it happens in control. In the legal field of technology, a promising idea is registered, ownership is secured, and that's it. It's frozen, harmless, inactive. This is one of the game's great secrets, and it was used against this car, and many others throughout the century. But here's the detail that makes it all even more shocking. A modern model from the car manufacturer, launched in 2021, has an electric propulsion system that follows practically the same architecture described in the technical documents of Project 512E. Coincidence? Hard to believe. It's as if the pieces of this puzzle had been scattered over time, waiting for someone, one day, to be able to put them together. This 1940s electric car was not a technical failure. He was such an early success that he had to be contained, because he showed the world a possible path, a cleaner, more economical, more accessible path, but a path that directly hurt the pockets of those in control. And here comes the great paradox. This technology could have saved billions in infrastructure, avoided decades of urban pollution, and taken transportation to another level since the last century. But she was buried by decision, by strategy, and all of this was left out of the books. Until today. Now that the documents are being recovered, that the names are beginning to emerge, and that previously invisible connections are becoming clear, the question remains: why haven't we talked about this openly? Why don't automakers own up to what they buried? Why didn't governments ever investigate? Why has the media never brought this topic to light? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Because history, as they say, is written by those who won. And in this case, fossil fuels won. But maybe, just for now. Today, when seeing so many challenges surrounding modern electric cars, range, cost, dependence on lithium, it is impossible not to remember that forgotten project. The one who already pointed out real solutions decades ago. And, more than a historical curiosity, this is a warning. How many solutions like this are being hidden now? How many projects are being stifled because they don't align with the right interests? Project 512E may even have been erased, but its existence casts a disturbing light on everything that came after. And maybe that's the real revolution, rediscovering what we already had and should never have lost. It may seem like just a historical curiosity, an isolated case buried in the dusty archives of a distant time. But make no mistake, the story of this electric car is not a closed chapter. It is a direct reflection of what we are still experiencing. Have you ever wondered why, even with all the technological advancement, electric cars still face basic challenges? Why does autonomy continue to be a barrier for millions of consumers? Why are prices so high? Why does charging infrastructure remain precarious in so many countries, even after years of promises and billions invested? The questions are current, but the answers have deep roots. The electric car that disappeared in the 1940s showed that it was possible to do things differently. He proved that alternative paths existed before Tesla even dreamed of existing. But the decision was different: to suffocate the new, to keep the old. And this behavior, unfortunately, is not in the past. Today, we still see the automotive industry being guided by interests that do not necessarily favor innovation. Large automakers who previously ridiculed electric cars are now investing in them, but at a controlled pace, always keeping an eye on the balance between profits, subsidies, and political pressure. And, most intriguingly, the difficulties faced by modern users of electric vehicles are, in many ways, the same problems faced decades ago: autonomy, recharge time, production cost. But couldn't these problems have been overcome much earlier if we hadn't erased projects like the 512e from history? Let's talk about autonomy. How many popular EVs today can go more than 300 kilometers on a charge? Some do, but most affordable models still don't deliver this. And even those that deliver depend on expensive, complex batteries with considerable environmental impact. The irony? The 1947 project already used a simpler, more durable technology with a very low disposal impact. Now, think about infrastructure. One of the main arguments against EVs today is, there are not enough outlets to recharge. This phrase is repeated like a mantra in public discussions, social media, and public policy debates. But in 1947, the forgotten car's original design proposed something even bolder: a quick-swap battery system, using standardized modules that could be replaced in less than 5 minutes. It was a system ahead of its time. And only now, in 2025, are some companies beginning to tentatively test it. And the cost? Today, there is a lot of talk about the price of electric cars. Almost always more expensive than combustion ones, even with incentives. The justification is the cost of batteries, onboard technologies, and small-scale production. But what if this was also the result of a forced delay? If projects like the 512e had prospered, we would have been developing and improving these technologies for more than 70 years. Batteries could be cheaper, standardized, produced on a large scale for decades. The lost time was a silent setback, a cost that we now pay with money and delay. And there's more. Today, there's a lot of talk about sustainability. Automakers' advertising campaigns are full of words like green, ecological, zero emissions. But the industrial model that supports this still relies heavily on the mining of lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, often extracted in precarious conditions with severe socio-environmental impacts. Meanwhile, cleaner technologies, such as the nickel-iron batteries used in the forgotten project, remain ignored. Why? Because they don't yield the same profits. Because they do not fit into the business models created around scarcity, planned obsolescence, constant consumer dependence. The truth is this: the story of the lost electric car is not a closed case. It's a cycle that repeats itself. The name changes. The decade changes. But the essence remains. Genius ideas emerge. They are muffled. They are replaced by more profitable and less efficient versions. Progress does not fail. It is locked. Today, we have companies competing for charger patents, while ordinary users struggle to find a working charging point. We have electric models that promise record autonomy, but cost more than twice as much as a popular car. We have governments that encourage electric cars while subsidizing fossil fuels at the same time. None of this is a coincidence. The connection with the past is in everything: in fear of disruption, in control of the narrative, in the protection of monopolies. But there is also something different now. For the first time, we have access to information. We have tools to investigate, compare, understand. What used to be erased with a fire or court order can today be unmasked by a scanned document, by an independent report, by a video like this. That's why telling this story matters. Because it reminds us that technology is not the only factor that defines the future. Human decisions, and the interests behind them, have the power to accelerate or delay progress for generations. The missing electric car was not just a casualty of the time. He is a silent witness to what happens when we leave innovation in the hands of those who are afraid of it. And, most importantly, it is a warning that the future is not guaranteed. That even now, as we advance with new technologies, the old structures are still alive. They still influence decisions. They still have the power to silence what does not suit them. So when you look at a modern electric car, don't just see innovation. See also the weight of decades of silence, sabotage, and delay. See what could have been, and see what could still be, if we don't allow history to repeat itself once. Again. Now that you know the story of the forgotten electric car, the sabotaged project, and the technology that could have changed everything, the question remains, did this only happen once? The answer is straightforward and disturbing. No. The story of this vehicle is just one of many, a piece of a larger puzzle which reveals how the most innovative ideas were systematically buried to protect the profits of those already at the top. Decade after decade, revolutionary technologies have come and gone. Some were not even presented to the public. Others were ridiculed. Others were purchased and locked in safes. The 1947 car case is the perfect example of this, but it's not the most extreme. There are even more impressive records. Electric cars that, in the 70s, already used rudimentary solar panels. Prototypes that could travel up to 500 km with homemade batteries. Models that not only solved the problem of autonomy, but also of recharging, with systems that today would seem like science fiction. And do you know what they all have in common? They were archived, silenced, and most of the time, forgotten on purpose. That's when you start to notice. We're not just talking about cars. We are talking about power. How innovation is controlled, shaped, released little by little, only when it is convenient. And if you're finding all this absurd, get ready, because the next story I'm going to tell you goes even further. There is a documented case of an electric car developed in the United States in the 90s. A car that passed all safety tests, which received praise from the specialized press, and which was even rented by Hollywood celebrities. A car that had everything it needed to be a market success. But he had an even crueler fate. This car was forcibly recalled by the manufacturers themselves. Each unit, one by one, was confiscated. And do you know what they did with them? They destroyed them all, with an official justification: experimental model, without commercial viability. Lie. You will understand the real reason in the next video. And when you know who pushed, who profited, and who lost from this decision, you'll realize that history is repeating itself right before our eyes. So, if you want to keep uncovering the stories they don't want you to know, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because in the next video, you will meet the electric car that was loved by its owners, but murdered by much larger interests. And don't forget, comment below, what would you have done if you had one of these vehicles in your hands in 1947? Would you have kept it? Would you have fought? Or simply accepted the imposed silence? Your opinion matters, because what you buried in the past is still shaping the future. And together, we'll dig it all up.